another lesson in web development. Today's lesson is actually the start of something quite exciting, and that is your core project for this module, which is titled HR System Backend Structure. Now, I do have a little surprise for this lesson in that we are going to revisit a specific topic that we covered in one of our recent lessons. But before we do that, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. Wonderful. Now, our first topic of interest for today is to revisit the HR system that I just referred to. Then we'll move on to creating the table structures for our HR system. So as you'll note, we have very little theory to cover today, and the bulk of this lesson is actually going to be a practical demonstration. Great. Now let's take a look at the HR system that we will be working on as part of our core project for the next couple of lessons. Now, if you recall, one of our previous core projects was actually to design the front end of an HR system. And within the system, you could add employees as well as upcoming interviews to this HR dashboard. And you could also include things like the details of our employees, such as their background or their job title, their department, their email address, as well as their salary. Now, what we're going to do going forward is we're actually going to create a back end to power this front end. Because if you remember correctly, every time we added an employee, once we refresh the page over here, that employee would disappear, for example. That is not necessarily what we want. So the idea behind our backend is to make sure that the data is actually persistent. And one of the reasons I decided to actually revisit this project is because I actually had quite a few requests from students to actually continue with this project by adding a backend. And that is what we're going to do in the next couple of lessons. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, the first thing we want to ensure is that we have access to Phpmyadmin via our localhost. And to do this, we can simply once again just head over to XAMPP, right click and say show or hide, or you could also access the control panel via your search bar at the bottom. And you want to make sure that your Apache server and your MySQL service is running in the background. I'll close this or minimize this, it's all the same. And now I'm simply going to create a new database. So I'll click on new over here and I'll call this HR-DB. So you'll notice that I have HR_test over here. That was simply used for a testing environment. Our production database and the database that we are going to be using going forward is going to be this newly created database of HR-DB. I'll then click create, and then you'll notice that my database has successfully been created. Excellent. Now with that out of the way, we can actually hop into Atom and we can start writing our code. So once you've booted up Atom and you are within the user interface, you can simply just go and create a new file over here. I'll first save this file as well. So save as, and I'm going to call this one L4, and my extension needs to be SQL. I'll go ahead and save. And now I can start scripting out my tables. Now, my first line of code is going to be a simple drop statement where I'm simply going to drop the table if this table already exists. So drop table if it exists. And the table I'm looking for is the employees table. Notice that I'm also using backticks over here. So if I click on this, I'll go ahead and I'll say employees. So employees. And this is just to say that if this table already exists, drop it and recreate the table. But we already know that the table does not exist because we just created our database. Then I'm going to go ahead and start creating the table. So I'll say create table. Also note that you could have this in small caps if you wanted to. In this case, SQL is not case sensitive with these reserved keywords. This is entirely up to you. So then I'll go ahead and open up a new set of backticks, and then I'll say that employees is the table that I want to create. Now, from previous lessons, we already know how to create tables, and the idea behind this is just to become familiar and for you to take this opportunity to practice your SQL code. This is also why we have this major project, okay? So I'll open up my parentheses over here, and then I'll start typing in or start creating the columns that I want in this table. In this case, I'm going to start with employee number, and this is going to be of type integer that takes in 11 characters or 11 numbers, and this is of not null. So this is a constraint that I'm adding to this table, and that is to say that employee number cannot be null. This is also going to be our primary key, and we'll enforce that rule later on when we complete this table. So I'll hop onto a new line, and then I'll create another column called last name. This is going to be of type varchar or varchar, whichever one you prefer. And then this is going to be of type not null, or have a constraint of not null. Then I'm going to add a new column over here. This one's going to be first name. And likewise, I'm also going to give this a data type of varchar. And then I'll make sure that the constraint over here is not null as well. Then we also have one for department, or department code in this case. Department code. This is going to be of type varchar as well. And this will take 10 characters. This will also be of not null. Now, let's just take a moment to discuss the department code column. Now, you can imagine that this is most likely going to be a foreign key from another table called the departments table, and we'll create this in a second. But also take note that even though this is code, I've given this a data type of varchar and not int. Now, the idea behind this is for you to also experiment to find out which method or which approach works best for you. Sometimes you want to use integers, other times you want to use characters or varchars. So for me to be flexible, or for me to experiment with being flexible, I'm going to keep this one as varchar. Okay, so let's move on to the next column. So over here, I'll have a new one called job title. And this is going to be of varchar as well. I'll give this one 50 characters and also not null. And then we have one more column to add, and that is going to be our salary column. So salary. And here I'm going to give this one an integer data type, because salaries tend to be integer data types. And I'll go something like 8 characters over here. And then also enforce the not null constraint. Great. So now that we have all our columns out of the way, let's just save this. We can start enforcing our primary key rules. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. So on a new line at the bottom of my salary column, I'm simply just going to enforce the primary key constraint. And the primary key I'm going to set here is going to be the employee code, or the employee number. Remember, the employee number is going to be the primary key of this table, but the department code is going to be the foreign key. But we do have one issue. If I try to create a constraint on my department code, on the departments table, I'm going to get an error. Why? Simply because the departments table does not exist yet. So we actually have to go and create the departments table to make sure that we have this reference, this department code, before we can enforce any sort of foreign key constraint. So what I'm going to do is, on a new line over here, I'm going to call drop table again. Let's actually just copy what we have at the top over here. I'll paste that over here, and I'll change this to departments. Great. So now I'm simply going to create the table, and I'll say create table, and this is going to be departments, and then I'll start adding the columns. So the first one here is going to be department code, as you've guessed, and this is going to be of type varchar, and I'll give this a value of 10. This will also have a not null constraint, and then we'll also have city perhaps as one of the columns. So city. I'll give this a data type of varchar as well. Give it 50 characters, also not null constraint. And then lastly, I'm going to add my department name. So department name. And then I'll give this a data type of varchar. And as you've guessed, I'm going to make this 50 as well. Let's just clean up our code. So varchar 50 and not null. Excellent. And then lastly, I just have to enforce that primary key on my department code, much like we've done over here with our employee number. So I'm going to go in and say primary key, and I'm going to enforce this primary key constraint on my department's code or department code like this. And then I'll close this off. Now we can actually go back to our employees table and create that foreign key constraint, because we do have a department code that exists in our departments table. Also keep in mind that when we run this code, we want to make sure that we first of all run the departments table before we run the employees table, because again, this reference needs to exist before this table can be created with that reference as a foreign key to our departments table. So on a new line over here, I'll just add a comma. I'm simply going to say key, and then I'll simply say department code. And in my parentheses over here, I'm going to make sure that I'm enforcing that constraint on my department code. And then on a new line over here, I'm simply just going to run the keyword constraint. And then I'll give this a reference. So I'll say employees IBFK. You can also name your constraint whatever you want to. Just make sure that it points to or shows some sort of reference to another table. And then over here, I'll say foreign key is on my department code, and the reference or the references over here is going to be to my departments table. And then lastly, I'll just make sure that that rule is enforced on my department code. And there we go. That should be it. And then I'll close this off over here, save the script. Now, fingers crossed, and let's run our code and hope that we don't have any errors. So the first block of code I'm going to copy is the one where I've created my departments table. Because remember, we want to enforce this primary key, and we want to make sure this primary key is available for our employees table. So I'll go ahead and copy all this over here, head back over to my browser, and I want to make sure that I'm under the HR-DB database. And then within the SQL tab over here, I'll simply just paste my code. And then I'll go ahead and hit go. And you'll notice that I get a success message. So far, so good. So let's hop over to the next table, and that's going to be our employees table over here. So I'll copy this table or this block of code. I'll head back over to SQL, and then I'll paste the code over here, hit go, confirm, and we have another success message. So we can actually see that our tables were successfully created under HR-DB. So we have a departments table and an employees table. Now there is one more table that we are going to add to this database, and that's going to be our interviews table. So let's go ahead and write up the code for that specific table. Now back in Atom, I'm going to create the interviews table. So I'm simply going to do the drop if exists again. So let's just copy and paste what we already have. And then on a new line over here, in backticks, I'll simply say interviews. And then I'll close this off. And then if the table does not exist, we will simply create it. So create table, open up my backticks, interviews. Let's just get this correct. So interviews. And then I'm going to start opening my parentheses so that I can add in the column names. So the first one over here is going to be department code. And as you've guessed, the department code over here is going to be a foreign key from my departments table. And the logic here is that if interviews are set up, maybe they belong to a specific department, or maybe someone in a specific department has to carry out that interview. So the next thing I'm going to do is add varchar over here. Then give this a value of 10 and set this to not null. Great. And then on a new line, I'll simply add another one called department. And then I'll give this var char, and this will be equal to 50. And then I want to set this to not null. Excellent. So I'll also specify the role. So role would be a new column, and I could have varchar over here. And then I'll give this a character limit of 50, and I'll set this to not null. And then the last one is going to be the status of that interview. So status, and then I'll add varchar once again, give it a value of 50, set this equal to not null, and that's it. So there's one constraint that I want to add to this, and that is going to be constraint. Open up my backticks, interviews underscore IB FK for foreign key underscore 2. And this is going to be of foreign key type. And I'm going to enforce this on my department code in my departments table. And the reference for this is going to be on the departments table. And then I'll make sure over here that in between my backticks that I'm referencing my department code. And that is going to be it for this table. Let's just do a bit of cleaning up. Bring this to the top over here. And now we have a new table. Now, you could argue that we actually don't need this department column over here. In fact, we could actually delete this, because if we had to build a join, we could easily get the department name from the departments table. So this is entirely up to you. But in this case, if I wanted to keep my code lean and clean, I would actually remove this. So then I have a simplified table with just 3 columns, and I can easily grab the department name simply just by grabbing the department name from here. Wonderful. Now, before I copy this block of code over here, I do have an error, and that is the quotation marks that I've added over here. You'll notice here I have backticks, and over here I have normal quotation marks. So I'll simply just delete this, open up my backticks, then add it all in once again, and then copy my code, save it as well, head back over to my SQL environment, paste my code, and if I hit go, confirm, everything has been created successfully. So now I have an interviews table, an employees table, as well as a departments table. And that is it for today's very brief session. In our next lesson, we're actually going to be slightly more brief. And in that lesson, we'll actually import all our data into our database. That is to say, we are simply just going to load the data into our database, which is something around 10, 12 lines of code. But again, the importance here is to start practicing how to create tables and how to load data, so that when we get to the PHP side of things again, things will start to make a lot more sense. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.